Okay, good evening. Thanks very much for having me. It's a real privilege to be able to come and speak to you tonight. So my name's David and I work at IG. I'm going to be blogging about some of what I talk about tonight. So follow me on Twitter or on Medium and I'll let you know once those things have gone live. I work at IG and we are a global provider for retail trading. So we provide web and mobile platforms for retail customers to be able to trade on the stock market through a variety of different kind of trading products. We have got a global presence, about 120,000 customers, and we book about 4.5 million trades a month. And we are under audit from a number of different regulators across the world, which gives us a unique set of challenges that we need to operate within. And tonight I want to talk to you about some of the lessons that we've been learning as we're trying to adopt continuous delivery at IG. So I want to start off with a question. How do you feel about deploying code into production? Now, with this being a continuous delivery meetup, I should imagine you're all absolutely fine with deploying code into production. You all love it. Personally, I've had mixed experiences. So my feelings have ranged from fear, stress, over planning to try and compensate, more often not, just stick my head in the sand and hope for the best. Which is really, really bizarre because we're all in software, whatever our roles, whether we're developers, QA, DevOps, because we love solving problems. We love solving problems and we love building tools that people can use to make their lives better in some kind of way. And so the irony is that if we dislike deploying code into production, this is the point when, this is the pinnacle of the creative experience. This is the point where our users get the benefit from all our hard work. So really, deploying code into production should be fun. It should be something we enjoy doing because that's when we really get the benefit from all our hard work. Before I worked at IG, I worked at a consultancy working in financial services as well. And we would work for banks and other large financial organizations. We'd normally be part of a large change program, some big delivery that would take years and years to run through. And so we'd be there coding away for months on end. And it would probably be weeks, if not months, occasionally years, before your code even got into their UAT environment, let alone into their production environment. And so when I moved to IG, it was absolutely fantastic because now we started deploying our code to production every month. And we had the monitoring and the tools to be able to see how your code was performing in production and to see how it was being used. Now the problem was that deploying code into production every month meant we had dozens of teams all piling in their changes into an environment in one go. And no matter how hard you try, no matter how well you plan and prepare for it, with that much change going into an environment in one go, inevitably there are going to be problems. And we have the same sort of problems with our releases into test as well. We release into test every day, where all the commits from the previous 24 hours go into the test environment. But again, with that much change, inevitably there are the occasional problems. And so since about 2012, we've been looking at IG on how we can improve on this situation and how we can make things better, how we can make releasing code into production or indeed any environment, how can we make it fun, something that we enjoy doing. And in 2013, I was involved in a project where we wanted to add a new feature into our web trading platform, which would highlight to users features of the platform that they hadn't used before. So it's a fairly feature-rich trading platform, lots of functionality, and we were aware that some users just weren't finding some of the cool stuff. So what we would do, we had a project where we would track and analyze what users were doing, and then we would surface up parts of the application that they hadn't seen before. And we started using some of these continuous delivery tools to make it easier for us to release our code into test. And as a developer working on that project, it was absolutely fantastic because it went from deploying code into test being something I didn't want to do just in case I got it wrong and broke the environment, to something I loved doing because it was risk-free, because it was easy. And it became a matter of a professional pride to see just how quickly you could get a feature, code it up, get it ready, get it into test, and get someone using it. And if there were changes to requirements or the API needed changing, it wasn't a problem because you could respond to those requirements quickly, code them up, get them into test, and the feedback loop was incredibly tight. So it was an absolutely fantastic project to work on, and the creativity that generated was just great. And after working on that project, I moved to be the tech lead for our API team. So this is the team that provides the API that our web and mobile platforms consume, and our public API as well. It's a really critical part of the infrastructure, and I was really keen that moving to this team, that we could start to learn and apply some of the tools we'd used from this previous project, not in just our deploys to test, but our deploys to production as well. But one of the challenges we faced is that the application that exposes our API was a large monolith. So there were some risks there as well. An absolutely critical application, couldn't afford to have any downtime, so there are going to be some challenges there. And one of the things that I'm sure you guys are aware of is that working in this space, there are some companies that do continuous delivery incredibly well and have really innovated in this field and have been really public with the way they do things. So thinking about some of the big names, Amazon, Netflix, Etsy, Spotify. Amazon have gone on record saying they deploy code into production every 12 seconds or something, and Netflix are really open about the way they do things as well. And the challenge with this is that it can just set the bar really high. And working in a regulated environment where currently we're not allowed to deploy some of our stuff into the cloud and make use of some of the technologies that these companies are using, it can just feel like the standard they set is unattainably high, and we'll never be able to be like that. But I think one of the things that we've found is that rather than focusing on any one particular technology that a company is using, any company can adopt continuous delivery. Because it's not the technology that you're using that matters, it's the principles behind the practice that matters. And if we focus on the principles of continuous delivery, rather than a particular technological approach, then any company, no matter what situation we find ourselves in, no matter technology stack we're operating on or whatever regulatory environment we have to work within, any company can get benefit from some of these principles. So we've been trying to focus on some of the some core principles of continuous delivery. We've been trying to work on separating deployments of our applications from the release of functionality in the new version of that application. We've been trying to automate everything. We've been trying to rely on our tests. And we've been trying to ensure that every commit that we make into master is treated as a release candidate. Prior to that, we would code away for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and then at the end of a period of time, you branch into UAT, and that becomes your release candidate, and you stabilize that, and then deploy it to production. And we're trying to move to a point where every time we make a merge into master, we treat that as an RC. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about how we've implemented that. So the first principle is separating the deployment of an application from the release of new functionality. So those two things is where there is risk. When you deploy an application, there's risk. Is it going to start up? Is it going to integrate with the environment well? And when you switch on new functionality, there's risk as well. Is the functionality going to do what you expected? Have you introduced a backwards incompatible change? That kind of thing. So we want to separate those two risky activities and build confidence in both of them before we serve live traffic. Now, there are loads of different ways that you can do that, and the approach that we've gone for is to use a technique called Bluegreen deploys. So we deploy our applications into a cluster. And what we decided to do is to mirror that cluster. And so that cluster now has two halves. There's a light half and it's a dark half, or blue and green in this diagram. So in this diagram is the blue half of the cluster that is serving live traffic. So all the live traffic's going through the blue cluster and none of it's going through the green cluster, which means we're free to deploy new versions of our application into the dark half, into the green cluster, anytime we want. We can deploy that application, we can check it starts up, we can connect to it and ensure that the new functionality is working correctly. And then when we're happy with it, it's a simple config switch in the load balancer and we can start serving live traffic through that half. And if we do find, once we're serving live traffic, that there's a problem, it's really easy for us to flip back. So that's how we're separating our deployments of new applications from the release of functionality. And I'm sure you're all aware that if we want to move to deploying our code into environments very frequently, that's just not going to be something that works if there are huge numbers of manual steps involved. If we want our developers to deploy code many times a day, that's not going to work if there's 10 or 20 manual steps that are easy to get wrong. So we very much tried to adopt the idea of using build pipelines and trying to automate everything where we can to make it easy for our development teams and our QA to do the right thing, make it easy for them to do what we want them to do rather than cut corners. So we built a fairly simple pipeline that when a developer merges code, we're using Bamboo, that checks out the code onto a new branch, it builds it, it runs all the tests against it, it deploys it into an in-memory container, runs some more tests. If all that's successful, it then tags it and deploys that tag into a repository, and then we deploy it into the dark side of the cluster, and then we automatically run some more tests against that new version of the application running in dark, just to make sure that everything's fine. And at that point, if it's still green at that point, then there's a manual block, and we can choose when we want to switch on that new version and have it serving live traffic. And then the process repeats in all our other environments as well, right up to production. So we use the same mechanism in each of our environments. So we just repeat that process. And we try to keep a really simple branching structure in Git as well. One of the principles we try to adopt is to make sure that we're seeing every time we merge to master, we treat that as a release candidate and get away from this idea of sitting with your headphones on for 4 weeks, coding into test, chuck it into UAT after that and deal with any bugs at that point. We're really trying to get away from that. So I'm sure it's a fairly common pattern you've probably seen before. We would create a feature branch to work on the new area of functionality. Guys would commit against that, and then when they're ready, they'd raise a pull request. The rest of the team give their kind and constructive comments on that code, and at the right point, that's merged back into master, and at that point, the Bamboo plan kicks in. So we try and keep a really simple branching structure that makes it very easy, but once a feature is complete, that we can get that out into prod. And I mentioned at the start that when I moved on to the API team, the API was a large monolithic application, and we were really aware that if we wanted to use these kind of processes and deploy code into production very often, we're going to need to break that monolithic application up into smaller services. Some might call them microservices, so that each part of the API that was cohesive would be its own application, and we could reason about change on that application and then deploy them independently of any other part of the API. So if there was one part of the API that was being changed, we could deploy that into production, being confident that we hadn't touched any of the really mission critical stuff, the dealing flow, the login flow, that kind of thing. So that's the approach that we're using so far, and we are using this to deploy our code into production, and we're getting real benefit out of it. But we're very much partway through the journey. I don't think we're anywhere near where we want to be yet, but we are really enjoying it, and we are getting loads of benefit out of it. So I just wanted to share a few of the lessons that we've learned so far, what we've learned. I think the first lesson we've learned is don't reinvent the wheel. Thanks to groups like this, there are just tons and tons of examples out there on how to apply continuous delivery in a whole host of different situations. So that blue-green deployment mechanism is a pretty common pattern that's been talked about quite a lot. So we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, and indeed when it came to the Bamboo pipeline that we built, that was a video that we had watched on YouTube by a consultant. We thought it fitted our pattern really quite well. So we got a graduate on our team, showed him the video, told him to go and build it, and a week later he'd built it, which was just fantastic and really quite humbling given the guy straight out of university with about 2 weeks commercial experience under his belt. That was great. I think another lesson we've learned is that 80% is good enough. I think there can be a real temptation to try and build the perfect continuous delivery pipeline and get everything absolutely shiny right. And what we found is that using the tools we already have, so using Bamboo, which was already our CI tool, and using the deployment mechanisms that we already had in place and expanding those to support Bluegreen, we've managed to get massive value for a much reduced cost than if we tried to build the perfect solution from scratch. And it's been great because we've been able to get loads of value from it, and we've been able to learn huge numbers of lessons from it as well. One of the things that we wanted to be able to do is to, as I mentioned, is to break up the monolithic API application into smaller microservices. And we were aware that just because of the way commercial development works, is that it was unlikely we were going to get a project where we could just focus on doing that. And so we had to make this refactoring exercise part of the projects that were already coming our way. And so I was really keen that when we got a project that was going to be working on a fairly low risk part of the API, that we'd be able to separate that out into its own service and really experiment on that. It didn't quite work out that way because the first bit of the API that we got a major project to work on was the login flow, which is one of the most mission critical part of the API. But if we hadn't taken the opportunity to refactor that out into its own service, we may not have got another opportunity to work on that area of code for quite a while. And so we had to seize the opportunities that the work that was coming our way gave us so that we could implement some of these things. And I remember one of the guys on our ops teams, when he heard about what we were doing, being quite nervous about the risk that we were introducing to the project, and he asked our chief technical architect if he was happy with what we were doing. And I remember it really clearly because he just turned and said, "I have absolutely no problems with this whatsoever," which put huge amounts of pressure on us to make sure we got it right. But it was okay. What we've really found is that the technical challenges that go along with continuous delivery are one thing, but the cultural challenges and the attitude of the development teams are a much bigger set of challenges. And I think this is really where we're at on our learning journey, is that we've got all the tooling. Now as a development team, it's how we make the most of them. And gone are the days when you can just give a developer a spec, let them put their headphones on and code away for 4 weeks and deal with all the bugs in a manual regression period. Now we need to be taking the attitude that when that piece of work is complete, is good enough to go into production straight away. And so we found that the maturity of the developers, the maturity of our QA engineers, and the maturity of our project management teams is absolutely critical to the success of this, and probably more so than the technical tools that we're using. When we started working on the proof of concept pipelines and tools that we were going to use, when we started demoing them to other people in the company, one of the things that they were nervous about was suddenly all this complexity that we were putting in to the pipeline compared to what we had previously. And one of the things that made it easier for them to accept that this was a tool ready for the enterprise was that all the scripts and everything that backed the pipelines were all stored in Git. So they were backed by version control. So all of the bamboo plans that we were building were just copies of each other, all backed by the same logic stored in one place. So any bug fixes to that logic could be shared by all these plans. So by thinking about these kinds of things and building in scalability right from the start, even when you're just at a proof of concept stage, makes it much easier to roll out when you need to. What I've shared this evening is about 3 years' work, all compressed into 25 minutes. And what we found at the start was that we started experimenting with these tools with 1 or 2 applications just in test. And it seemed to take us ages before we got to the point where we could really get the benefit in a production environment. But what we found now is that the takeoff has just been incredible, that as we've been talking more and more about what we're doing, other teams in the company are taking advantage of it as well. And within our own teams, the adoption is increasing and increasing, and the developers are really seeing the benefit of it, and we're really able to deliver projects into production much faster than we were. So I think oftentimes when you start this kind of change, it can feel like you're getting nowhere, that you're making very little progress, and is the effort really worth it? But the growth is exponential, so just to encourage you on that. Working in a regulated environment, there's a reasonable amount, if not quite a lot, of bureaucracy associated with getting changes into a live environment. And there are good reasons behind that. And working in the financial services sector, those things are not going to go away. And it seems like the more countries you operate in, the worse it gets, because you have more auditors to comply with. And what we found is that if we just accept the fact that this bureaucracy is not going to go away, but actually embrace the bureaucracy and try and improve the process, then we can really make headway with that. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is that there's a reasonable amount of paperwork every time you want to deploy something into production, and that stuff all needs authorizing and approving. So we try to automate that as well. So we've built internal applications that look at what you're about to deploy, work out all the changes between what you're about to deploy and what's in production, and automatically generate that paperwork as well. And just to make it fun, we built it in Clojure as well, so it's a good learning opportunity. Oftentimes, there can be a tendency, when you've found something that works, to go and talk to senior management about it and say, you really need to roll this out across all the other teams. And we really haven't gone down that path at all. Instead, what we've done is talked an awful lot about what we've done and shared with other teams the journey that we've been on so far. And we've been really honest. We've shared the problems that we've been trying to solve, the things that have worked, the things that haven't, the challenges we face by trying to adopt continuous delivery in the way we work. And what we found is that just team after team has just been really, really interested in what we're doing. And I really wish we'd documented it better, because we just have the same conversations over and over again. And it just makes me think if we'd written it down, then they'd have something better to refer to. But just the power of evangelism, the power of just being passionate about what you're doing, about sharing your experiences, about being honest, not trying to sell it, but just being honest, is just really, really effective. Thank you so much for giving me the time to come and talk to you tonight. It's been absolutely fantastic. I don't know if you've got time for questions now. Yeah. But I'd love to hear from your experiences as well. So definitely be going to the pub afterwards. So I'd really love to hear from you guys. But now, does anyone have any questions? Gentleman in the back.
So you talked about automating the paperwork.
Yeah.
Did people catch on to the fact that you were doing that? And did they get stuff like that, or did it break down any walls? How did that work?
I think we tried to be really proactive with it. So we knew which people would care the most, and we initiated the conversation with them first before before they got wind of that we were doing anything they didn't know about. And so we started those conversations early. And I think what we really believe is that actually we can improve the accuracy of the paperwork because it's all programmatically driven. And so it's not relying on a developer going, fix some bugs, deploy into prod. I mean, whereas now we can actually say, no, this is exactly every single change that we're deploying into production, which has got to make an auditor happy. Yeah, over here. Sorry, yeah.
Did you collect any stats on how much it's improved your processes? So do you have a benchmark beforehand to say what things are going wrong and anything afterwards to show how much you improve things?
We haven't collected any particular stats on that. So we've got anecdotal evidence. I think so. We deploy into test an awful lot, many times a day without impacting the stability of the environment. So I think certainly anecdotally for us, I don't think there are some people in the company I don't think are aware of how often we release into test. And I think then in terms of the improvement it's had in production, anecdotally again, I think people within the business are kind of becoming much more aware that if they come to us with something they want in production, we're likely to be able to turn it around much faster. But we haven't collected any particular stats around that. Yeah.
So this testing was converted from monolithic UA deployment to rapid deployment environment. You should have had some problems. So it's something really simple, but prepping in real life, I don't think it's what do you mention on it?
Well, I think so. It's taken us 3 years to get that far, and it's not a wonderfully technically sophisticated solution. So I think we've done it fairly slowly, which means that any problems we've had, we've caught early. Now, there have been times when we've deployed stuff into production and there's been a problem, but we have been able to roll it back incredibly quickly. So I think probably the problems we're really facing are that we're not using it as much as we could. We're not using it as much as we should, and that's even within my team where we've got all this tooling and everything's built. So I think the challenges we're really facing are a cultural much more than technical.
Other than Bluegreen, did you consider any other strategies?
I joined the company after Bluegreen had been chosen, so to ask someone else. I think one thing we'd love to move towards is some of the patterns that other companies use, which is rather than always having this fallow cluster being in place, has been able to programmatically spin up a new instance, deploy the application to that, and build it up that way. So I think that probably technically that's the next thing we will try and tackle.
I see a lot of non-automated tests. What kind of tests do you have at different levels?
Yeah, so we try and stick to the famous test pyramid of unit tests and then component tests and end-to-end tests. And I think probably historically at IG we've often had that pyramid the wrong way round, and being so dependent on tests has really forced us to get our automated testing strategy right, because end-to-end tests that rely on real test fixtures in an environment are costly to maintain. So when we build the application at the first stage in the pipeline, it's unit tests, component tests, and some end-to-end tests. And then on deployment into each application, we run a series of end-to-end tests against the application at that point, which exercise the RESTful API and check that that's doing what it should be doing. We write that using Cucumber because we're really trying to work with our QA engineers on that.
How long does that whole test suite take to run? And did you have to improve it at all?
So it takes about, if you run it all sequentially, depending on the application, it's about half an hour. We haven't had to do any we haven't had to run any of it in parallel to improve performance or anything like that. We're really trying to keep the applications really small and quite simple.
Have you found that it's starting to change the things that you're asked to do yet? Because you're going faster than most people. Are the business learning that you're going faster? Or maybe we could just try something that we wouldn't ordinarily have tried if it had taken 3 months to do. It's only going to take you 2 weeks.
Yeah, I think so. I think there is a real change happening, particularly in our product ownership teams, around being able to use build, measure, learn a lot more. But I think probably a bigger change than that we're seeing is the idea that we don't have to get a product completely right when we launch it, that we can get it good enough to go, and then 80% right, and then iterate on that. And I think that's a real mind shift change for people, because the quality of what we deliver is really important to us. And so traditionally we've really focused on getting it really polished. Whereas I think there's realization that if we can get something to production live earlier, we can really capitalize on that. Okay, thank you very much for your time.